What would you do if the very people you trusted most shattered your world in the most unthinkable way? In a small, tight-knit community, one man found himself confronting that very question. His wife, his partner in life, had betrayed him. But it wasn't just any betrayal. Her affair was with the one man sworn to uphold faith and morality, a priest.
This is the story of John, a man whose devotion turned to despair, whose heartbreak turned to fury. In the quiet of one night, fueled by rage and humiliation, John made a decision that would end two lives and leave a community grappling with the fallout of a betrayal so profound it stained the very walls of their sacred sanctuary. A marriage shattered, a sacred trust broken, and a town forced to reckon with the darkness that can hide behind closed doors and whispered prayers. How did love and faith turn into obsession and murder? And what could drive a man to such a horrific act of vengeance? This is a story of betrayal, blood, and a brutal reckoning, a true crime that shocked the nation. John and Emily's marriage seemed, at first glance, like the picture of stability. John, a diligent and hard-working man, provided for his family with an unwavering sense of duty. Emily, his wife, was seen as the cornerstone of their home, a supportive partner who managed their lives with grace and care. Together, they appeared to be the embodiment of a strong, devoted couple. But beneath the surface, there were cracks that no one else could see. The long hours John spent at work began to take a toll on their connection. Their conversations grew shorter, their shared moments fewer. Emily, once filled with warmth and affection, began to feel isolated and unseen. To the outside world, their marriage was solid, but within the walls of their home, an emotional distance was growing, a chasm that neither seemed willing to bridge. It was during this time of vulnerability that Father Michael entered the picture. A man revered by the community, he was more than a spiritual leader. He was a confidant, a counselor, a source of comfort in times of need. Parishioners trusted him with their secrets, their doubts, their fears. For Emily, he became a lifeline, a person who seemed to truly see her when she felt invisible. What began as occasional conversations after Sunday Mass soon became private sessions, moments where Emily could unburden herself, confiding in Father Michael about the struggles in her marriage. At first, his words were those of guidance and reassurance, his role purely pastoral. But over time, those boundaries began to blur. The connection between them deepened, crossing from platonic to something far more dangerous. As Emily sought solace, Father Michael offered more than comfort. He became a figure of temptation, someone who filled the void that had grown in her marriage. What started as an escape from her loneliness spiraled into a secret relationship, one that would not only destroy the trust in her marriage, but unravel the lives of everyone involved. The affair between Emily and Father Michael was, at first, carefully hidden beneath a veil of discretion. Late-night phone calls that began with innocent intentions evolved into whispered conversations filled with longing. Their stolen moments became more frequent. Clandestine meetings behind the rectory, shared glances during Mass that lingered a moment too long. What they believed to be private was beginning to leave traces, subtle yet undeniable. John, ever focused on his work, was slow to notice the shift in his wife's behavior. But as weeks turned to months, the changes became harder to ignore. Emily, once attentive and present, grew distant. She began spending more time away from home, often with vague explanations. There were whispers in the community, passing remarks about her closeness to Father Michael, but no one dared to speak openly. Yet, the pieces of the puzzle began to form in John's mind. At first, John dismissed his suspicions, blaming his own overworked imagination. But as Emily's demeanor changed further, her guarded phone calls, the way she avoided his questions. His doubts grew into something he could no longer ignore. The tension between them reached a breaking point one evening, when John confronted her directly. Emily denied everything, her voice steady, but her gaze faltering. She insisted that her meetings with Father Michael were purely spiritual, a source of guidance and strength. But John wasn't convinced. He felt the truth lingering just beneath the surface, taunting him. Days turned into a silent war within their home, with Emily avoiding John's probing questions, and John growing more restless by the hour. Then came the moment that shattered any illusions he might have held. One evening, following his gut instinct, John decided to follow Emily after she left the house. His heart sank as he watched her meet Father Michael in a secluded spot behind the church, their familiarity with each other leaving no room for doubt. It was no longer a suspicion. It was undeniable proof of her betrayal. For John, this was the final straw. The lies, the secrecy, the violation of everything he believed in. It all coalesced into a searing rage that he could no longer contain. The betrayal wasn't just personal. It was a desecration of his trust, his marriage, and his faith. And in that moment, the course of all their lives shifted irreversibly toward violence. In the days following John's discovery of the affair, his mind became a battleground of anger, humiliation, and despair. He withdrew from those around him, retreating into a dark and obsessive state. Every moment of silence felt deafening, filled with the replay of what he had seen. Emily with Father Michael, their betrayal etched into his thoughts like a scar that would not heal. He stopped sleeping, consumed by thoughts of how deeply he had been deceived, how everything he had built was crumbling before his eyes. John became fixated on the idea of confronting them. He needed answers, an explanation, something to make sense of the pain that gnawed at him. He began watching Emily more closely, tracking her movements. Each time she left the house with an excuse, it fueled his growing fury, his certainty that her lies continued unabated. The betrayal wasn't just festering in his heart, it was consuming him. On the night it happened, John followed Emily once more. She left the house under the pretense of running errands, but John knew better. With a cold determination, he tailed her car at a distance, his grip tightening on the steering wheel as she turned toward the church. Parking in the shadows, he watched as Emily stepped out of her car, glancing around nervously before slipping into the back entrance of the rectory. Minutes later, Father Michael arrived, his hurried steps betraying his own guilt. John waited, his pulse pounding in his ears. The sight of them meeting in secret once again ignited the rage that had been simmering for days. Unable to contain himself any longer, he stepped out of his car and followed them inside. His footsteps were heavy, purposeful, echoing through the quiet halls of the rectory. When he finally found them, the sight that greeted him left no room for doubt. Emily and Father Michael stood too close, their whispered exchange a damning confirmation of their betrayal. The confrontation erupted instantly. John's voice, trembling with rage, cut through the air like a knife. Emily spun around, her face pale with shock, while Father Michael stepped forward, his hands raised in a futile attempt to defuse the situation. But John was beyond reason. He demanded answers, shouting accusations that filled the room. Emily pleaded with him, tears streaming down her face, while Father Michael tried to intervene, offering apologies that only inflamed John further, and then it happened. In the chaos of their argument, John pulled a gun from his jacket, a weapon he had brought in a moment of desperation, one he hadn't planned to use but now held with shaking hands. Emily screamed, begging him to stop, but John's fury had reached its breaking point. He fired once, the sound deafening in the small space. Emily collapsed, her pleas silenced forever. Father Michael, frozen in fear, attempted to retreat, but John's rage was unrelenting. Another shot rang out, and the priest fell to the ground, his life ending in the very place he had preached forgiveness. As the silence settled over the room, John stood motionless, the weight of what he had done crashing down on him. The gun slipped from his hand, clattering to the floor. For a moment he simply stared at the bodies of the two people who had betrayed him, their lifeless forms a testament to the depth of his anguish and fury. Then, without a word, he turned and walked away, leaving behind a scene of devastation that would haunt the town forever. The crime scene was discovered early the next morning. A staff member from the church arrived to begin preparations for the day's services, only to find the rectory door ajar. What greeted them inside was a scene of unspeakable horror. Emily and Father Michael, both lifeless, their bodies lying in a pool of blood. Shock quickly turned to panic, and within minutes, the police were on the scene, their arrival shattering the eerie silence of the early hours. For the officers who responded, it was a crime unlike any the small town had ever seen. The sanctity of the rectory had been violated in the most brutal way, and the victims, so well known in the community, left everyone reeling. Investigators quickly began piecing together what had happened. Emily's purse, still by her side, held her identification, while Father Michael's clerical collar confirmed his identity. But one question loomed large. Who could have committed such a heinous act? As the investigation unfolded, it didn't take long for suspicion to turn toward John. Neighbors reported seeing his car near the rectory late the previous evening, and his noticeable absence from home the next morning only deepened the suspicion. When officers went to his house, they found him sitting alone in the living room, staring blankly at the wall, as though frozen in time. Beside him, on the coffee table, was the gun used in the murders. Without resistance, John allowed himself to be taken into custody. During questioning, John confessed to the crime with a chilling calmness that left investigators unsettled. He recounted the events of the night before, his voice steady as he explained the betrayal he had discovered and the rage it had ignited. The gun he had left behind was a key piece of evidence, its ballistics matching the bullets found at the scene. Surveillance footage from a nearby building further placed him near the church at the time of the murders. The case against John was overwhelming. Between his confession, the weapon, and the eyewitness accounts of his behavior in the days leading up to the crime, there was little doubt about his guilt. For the police and the community, the arrest provided an answer to the horrific events of that night. But it also left behind a trail of grief, anger, and unanswered questions about how a once devoted husband could be driven to such an unthinkable act. The trial of John captivated the nation, as the courtroom became the stage for a debate that would divide public opinion. On one side stood the prosecution, painting John as a man whose actions were coldly premeditated. They argued that his decision to arm himself and follow Emily to the rectory demonstrated a calculated intent to confront and kill. The evidence, they said, was clear. John had ample time to walk away, but chose vengeance instead. The defense, however, told a very different story. They portrayed John as a broken man, driven to the edge by an overwhelming sense of betrayal and humiliation. They argued that his actions, while tragic, were not premeditated but the result of extreme emotional distress. This was not the act of a calculating killer, they claimed, but of a man who had been pushed beyond his limits. Witness testimonies added depth to the narrative, each offering a glimpse into the lives shattered by the crime. Members of the church spoke of Father Michael's role in the community, emphasizing the trust and respect he had once commanded. Friends of Emily described her as a loving woman caught in a moment of weakness, a victim of her own poor decisions. And John's colleagues and neighbors painted him as a man who had always been steady and kind, until the events leading up to the murders changed him. Perhaps the most gripping testimony came from members of Emily's family, who spoke of the devastation her death had caused, their words laced with both sorrow and anger. They condemned John's actions, calling them unforgivable, and demanded justice for Emily and Father Michael. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as their voices echoed through the room. When it was John's turn to take the stand, his demeanor was somber. He expressed remorse for his actions but did not shy away from describing the depth of his pain and betrayal. He spoke of the years he had devoted to his marriage, of the moment he discovered the affair, and of the rage that consumed him that fateful night. His words were heavy, filled with a raw honesty that left some jurors visibly moved. Yet, for others, his justification only reinforced the idea that his actions were deliberate, not impulsive. The closing arguments were as emotionally charged as the trial itself. The prosecution asked the jury to focus on the facts, the premeditation, the weapon, the deliberate choice to confront Emily and Father Michael. The defense, in turn, pleaded for understanding, urging the jury to see John as a man overcome by heartbreak, not a monster. After hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict: guilty on 2 counts of second-degree murder. While the prosecution had pushed for a harsher sentence, the jury acknowledged the mitigating circumstances of John's emotional state. The judge handed down a sentence of 30 years to life in prison, a decision that left the courtroom divided. For some, it was justice served. For others, it was a reminder of how a moment of fury can destroy countless lives. In the shadows of love and faith, betrayal brewed a storm of despair, leaving behind a trail of heartbreak and lives forever lost. It is a reminder that even in our darkest moments, we must seek help, find perspective, and above all, resist the pull of actions that can never be taken back. If this story gripped you and left you wanting more, make sure to like this video and share your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think drove John to the edge, and how could this tragedy have been prevented? We'd love to hear your perspective. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories that uncover the darker side of human nature. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time with another story that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew.